Greetings and welcome back. I am very pleased today to be joined by a young man of many talents, very bright, very intelligent, pugilistically speaking, very skilled, and surprisingly well-versed in multiple subjects. It is our great fortune to present to you the Lord of Ireland, Corsica, who will be telling us about what's now called the modern Republic of Ireland, but I think we'll be delving a bit into the history and get a sense of what constitutes Ireland and what makes Ireland what it is, going beyond the tropes and stereotypes of the fourth-generation American who gets drunk on St. Patrick's Day and then declares his Irishness, which is a very common thing I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So thank you for joining me.
It's nice to be here. It's nice to talk to you. I would say that whole fourth-generation American getting drunk and declaring their Irishness, we do that as well. It's not just them.
I realize that, but they don't really have that. Well, they're not really claimants of the throne, are they? They're sort of culturally, they just have no real connection. I grew up with many such quote-unquote Irish Americans, and they had no connection to it whatsoever. Some of them attended a Catholic, sort of Irish Catholic school, but that was about it. So
you can generally tell how ignorant they are on Irish culture depending on their reaction to the term IRA.
Right.
As you know, yeah, because there's two very distinct sects of the IRA. There's the initial one, which came about from, well, I won't say in 1916, but in the War of Independence. And then you have the Provisional IRA, who are the more modern-day version and are restricted mostly to Northern Ireland.
They're also the more Marxist version, if I recall. Right?
The IRA always had a Marxist... Irish nationalism has always had a slightly Marxist bent since the Land War. It was around when Home Rule started becoming a big thing again in Ireland, about 1870. There was an issue between renters and their landlords. So it helped serve as a testing pot for Marxist ideas and for the lower class rising up against the upper class. You also see this in the Great Strike and Lockout in Dublin, for instance.
Interesting. So, it's always a question of where we'd like to start, but I'd say at the outset that Ireland had been pretty much left alone until comparatively recently in terms of the many conflicts and interactions in Europe compared to places such as modern France or Germany or even Britain. It wasn't really even the Viking interventions, you could argue, are pretty late compared to all the stuff going on throughout the rest of Europe. Perhaps we could start somewhere around there. Where would you like to start? As a Lord of Ireland, what would be your preference?
Well, realistically, the main thing most listeners will be interested in is the English-Irish conflict. Yeah. And that really starts around around 1200 AD, after the Norman invasion of Ireland. And as you said, there was also a number of Viking invasions. But these were never huge overall changes in demographics. The Irish interbred with Normans and the Vikings, but we still had our own functional laws. The Breton laws were still present. We were still widespread throughout the country, and the country was fairly built up and civilized. The main conflict with England tends to start with Henry II, who takes a tiny part of Dublin, if I recall. And he starts saying, okay, we will slowly start taking over Ireland.
Yes, and then briefly, that's called the Pale, historically.
The Pale.
Yeah.
Been a while since I've heard that term. After that, then, there's a bit of a brief break. And the English seem to lose interest in Ireland until King Henry VII and King Henry VIII. And this happens because King Henry VIII wants to start increasing his resources and his finances so he can keep warring with France, because he was a fan of wars. So he starts trying to claim more and more of Ireland. But like his father before him, who only makes a small movement into Ireland. He tries a small invasion and it doesn't go well for him. King Henry VIII also has problems like this, but he has a number of problems throughout his reign, as you're probably aware, with turning England into a Protestant Anglican country. And this doesn't fit well with Ireland because Ireland had always been historically Catholic and very strongly historically Catholic, even at this point. There's a lot of Gothic literature and Gothic texts were saved by Irish monks who would spend their entire lives transcribing the texts of older civilizations. So Catholicism has a very strong hold on the Irish collective consciousness. And that's why the daughter of King Henry VIII, Mary II or Mary I, Tudor, I think Mary II, isn't really interested in invading Ireland. She's more interested in purging heretics and turning England back to Catholicism and away from Protestantism. So again, Ireland goes fairly unmolested under her rule. There's a small portion of Dublin known as the Pale, which has been taken by the English, but mostly the country is still Breton lords, Gaelicized Normans, and a few Viking settlements here and there. And it's only under Elizabeth I where you see a big change in the English approach to Ireland. This is in the plantation in Ulster. And the plantation in Ulster actually goes a lot like how the Roman Empire and Roman Republic used to treat their old veteran soldiers. You would get a contingent of men, put them in a foreign country, and you would hope that your men and your culture would they would be able to hold it much better than just ruling over natives. So this is when the plantation starts in Northern Ireland. Queen Elizabeth offers a number of, I believe, Calvinists, Scots, a few Welshmen maybe, positions and places in Northern Ireland for them to raise families, start up farms, and get really into and be able to control the land and use it as they wished. Obviously, this doesn't go down exactly well with the Irish, but the thing is that Ireland is very much split into a number of smaller kingdoms, like you would have seen in Gaul before the Roman invasion. Because despite the fact the Bretons and the Normans have been there for a long time now, they're still disputing with each other. It's many petty lords, so there isn't much of an organised resistance to Queen Elizabeth's plantation. So the Irish are pushed out of Ulster and they're pushed further down. And it's this, you get a slow, steady trend of the Irish losing territory and losing more and more of the country from the north, slowly moving down to the south, until Munster is one of the only free province left. This is about 1500 now, I'd say. And this is the time where you would have the Irish get into contact with the Spaniards.
Yeah, I wanted to remark on something and perhaps ask you if you'd agree that given the prominent role of Elizabeth and just the timeline itself, I mean, this is obviously the beginning of proper colonialism as we understand it, and I wonder if the expansionist tendencies that were observed or could be observed in Ireland are merely a reflection of a larger tendency throughout European policy, monarchical policy, to sort of expand. I mean, rather because it otherwise it just seems strangely fortuitous, but it seems to be part of an overarching thing that was going on at the time.
Well, it's definitely fair to say that Ireland was an experiment of sorts. And you see this, the attitude of England towards Ireland is always quite different to its other colonial targets, because Ireland is so close. And it's very easy for England to express control over Ireland, and for England to... They almost want, as time passes, England almost wants to treat Ireland as a part of England itself, as much a part as Scotland, or somewhere that's geographically located onto it. And you can definitely see with the first plantation here, it's an experiment to see how effective this strategy is. And it proves to be very effective. Because not only has the culture been changed, but the entire demographic of people in the north has changed. Their religion has changed. All of their national ties. So not only are you taking the land, but you're also building a fortress, let's say. A place to strike out from. So it's a lot harder for the Irish to take back. And I mean, this is why we still have issues to this day, 500 years later or so, let's say.
Well, I mean, agreed. A lot of important history to skip over there to go to the current year, though.
Oh, sure. It's just important to keep in context that you could almost say the strategy works too well. The divides in Ireland are so big that even now, when it doesn't suit England, they can't really tie them over.
Yeah.
And that happens for a lot of reasons, because not only do you see a loss in Irish culture of, well, dominion, but as I was saying, with the South, we lost a lot of our lords and our nobility. Because around this time, there's only... I'd have to check up their names again. One of them is Fitzgerald, right? There's very few earls and noblemen left in Ireland.
Which is incidentally a French name, but yeah.
Well, as I said, you had Normans coming into Ireland as well, so it's to be expected.
I was merely pointing out that that's the legacy of Norman interaction right there. But
yes, these the Fitzgerald dynasty of Kildare, and they align with another dynasty who, I really have to check it up there. But they align with another dynasty of Irish lords, and they say, right, we will hold the English off at Munster. Munster will be the last stronghold of what is Ireland compared to this English overlord. And to do this, again, to contact with the Spaniards. And this is where you often hear those old Iberian Celtic jokes, because the Spaniards at this time are in conflict with England, so they agreed to send a portion of soldiers over to Ireland to meet up with the Irish lords at the battle at Kinsale Castle. But the winds proved too strong for the Spanish fleet, and they arrived there early. So the Irish lords are caught unprepared with their allies up in Kinsale Castle. So you get a very interesting siege where the Spaniards are holding the castle, the English are surrounding the Spaniards, and the Irish ride up to try and help the Spaniards, and they get absolutely crushed. So then, our nobility, the flight of the earls happens, and most of the noblemen leave Ireland. So this is the point of Protestant hegemony, where a lot of that racial tension I referred to is going to start being generated from. You see this not only in King James II, who was a Catholic, by the way, attempt to use Ireland as a weapon against a government that was starting to lose its taste for him in the English Civil War. And he comes to Ireland at this time, and King James basically says, look, if you follow me, I will help turn England back to a Catholic country, and we will start treating you more fairly again. And the Irish, they obviously prefer a Catholic overlord to the Protestant overlord that was seen from the English Constitution, and particularly Oliver Cromwell. But at this point, the Irish aren't well trained. We've lost most of our militaries, and beyond Munster, most of the country has been kept under control of the English. And this would be about...
17th century.
This would be about 17th. Yeah, this would be about 1685 until the Glorious Revolution in 1688.
I just feel, Corsica, that I don't want to be remiss, but I mean, we can't really skip over the impact of Oliver Cromwell, which we're sort of.
No, this would be around the time of Cromwell.
Yeah, but I mean, as far as I know, it's mid 17th. Cromwell is, I believe, 1640s, In the 1640s, 1650s, and James II is later, if I recall. But I don't want to.
Yeah,
So that's why.
1653.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. But I mean, he's well, in theory, a hated figure to this day. So I think.
Well, he most certainly is. There's a number of reasons for that. The most classic is the phrase "to hell or to Connacht," and that's a phrase that comes after he takes over England after driving out the Catholic royalty at the time, I think. He takes over England and he turns it into a more constitutional democracy. But then he comes to Ireland and he wants Ireland to be more unified under England. And anyone who rebels or anyone who shows dissent towards this more, I'd almost say autocratic, but that doesn't feel correct. This more totalitarian regime, this more under the English control regime, is tarred and feathered, or they're killed, or they're basically made into indentured servants and sent over to America. And this is why at the time, the phrase "to hell or to Connacht" was very notable, because Connacht is the western part of Ireland. It has probably some of the worst soil in Ireland. It's very wet. It's hard to live in. It's a very stony, unpleasant place to live. And they were essentially told, you can either move there if you're a traitor, or else I'll kill you, or else I will ship you off to America or Australia. And this is where you often hear that whole white slavery idea getting bounced around about by certain quarters. Because people would say that the Irish indentured servants were really more slaves, as they didn't have any choice in heading over there, as they were forced to go over there, and as they were given terrible conditions.
Now, do you subscribe personally to, I mean, I think, as far as I understand it, the accurate term is indentured servitude, which is not necessarily identical to slavery.
It was definitely indentured servitude, but a lot of people, when they hear that, they have a certain image in mind of someone willingly choosing that, and of that not being extended to your children and your nationality.
Yeah.
But the fact is that the English for a long time were trying to come up with reasons about why they deserved to treat the Irish how they did. So they didn't actually see them as English, and as white, let's say. And they didn't even see them as human in some contexts. So the treatment of the Irish indentured servants was still utterly abysmal, and would be very bad. It would be comparable to chattel slavery, but not as bad. But I would say they are very, very similar, and you could easily make the argument that it was a kind of slavery, and they just gave it a slightly better term. I mean, at that point, really, you're debating labels more than anything else.
No, that's fair. I mean, but then, as you know, as you said, in certain quarters, it's always tricky because people are ideologically motivated. Some people will describe black American slavery in a hyperbolic fashion. Other people will downplay it, and vice versa with regards to Irish indentured servitude. So it's one of those things that it would be hard to get a really accurate account of because there's so many biased sides, you know.
In regards to slavery, what a lot of people see as terrible about it is that it removes freedom of choice and determination of your own future. And if you were saying those were two of the worst things about slavery, you could easily extend that to the Irish indentured slaves, because they had no choice in the matter. Yeah. And they were forced to labour over there with no choice. So if you wanted to draw it along those lines, you could make the argument they were very similar. But obviously everyone has an agenda they like to pursue, and they will misconstrue or obfuscate facts to push that agenda. But with Cromwell, this leads to a lot of hate. Well, there was already hatred because land had been seized, but with Cromwell you get a variety of very brutal tactics. As I mentioned, tarring and feathering, hangings of people who are seen as showing dissent. So his brutality is up there. It's up there with the Black and Tans, where if you wanted to motivate an Irish nationalist to start getting irritated, he would be one of the first examples you go to. The Famine would be another classic one, but we're getting ahead of ourselves there. So, after the Irish try an uprising again and fail under Cromwell, they try it again under King James later on, towards the 17th century. And that fails as well. And then you could probably skip ahead to the next Irish rebellion, which is about 1798 under Wolfe Tone. This is one of the better organised ones, because Wolfe Tone spends a lot of time trying to train up a military, making connections with France and America and other countries, because he's been inspired by the recent revolutions. But unfortunately, Wolfe Tone's plans of rebellion are compromised, because there was a mole within the Irish faction. So his whole dreams of saving Ireland are destroyed before he even really has a chance to land with his army that he was going to land with. So for a long time, Wolfe Tone keeps trying to organise a new rebellion to come back to Ireland with the soldiers he trains, but it never ends up happening. And the soldiers that he did train go on to be called the Flying Gulls, if I remember correctly.
Now, eventually we'll get to the famine. That's really important. But at this stage, what would you say, the religious division? What's the level of religious division in Ireland?
Well, have you ever heard of the hedge schools in Ireland?
The hedge schools? No, actually, I'm unfamiliar.
So in Ireland, at about the time of Cromwell, it's made illegal for people to practice Catholicism in public. And it's been made illegal for people of Catholic backgrounds, who are generally Irish, of course, to get certain kinds of education. So the priests of the time resort to hedge schools, where they lead people out into the country and they teach children in secret things about their culture, things about Catholicism in general, and about the past and what has happened since the British arrive. And you tend to see that along with the hedge schools, the Brehon laws are gone now. The old Irish law system is gone. The new law system favours the English mostly, as is to be expected. Most land tends to go to English landowners. Starting around this period and only getting worse over time until you reach the worst point of the famine itself, which will eventually lead to the land war, where there's a huge conflict over Irish land ownership. But the hedge schools are only one symbol of it. There's many others as well. There's the fact that it's harder for the Irish to own lands. They can't get as good educations. Any high-paying jobs are generally, you would bring in someone from abroad who is English to do that, instead of bothering to train up an Irish person. So they're kept quite firmly under in a proletariat class, doing very menial labour such as farming, or, well, there isn't really much to the mine in Ireland either, so you might get leather being sold, let's say, or fishing. But as a whole, the Irish people are mostly confined to farming.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing you mentioned, because this is all happening at a time when there's a burgeoning scientific method on the continent. There are prominent philosophers and thinkers and scientists in Britain proper, and it seems that in the case of Ireland, a lot of, I don't like to use the term artificial, but I'll use it for the sake of description, a lot of these artificial impediments and interventions prevented a similar flourishing. Of course, there's some, there's Berkeley, the philosopher, but I mean, the numbers, it is a small country, obviously, seem to be smaller, and I can't help but think that there were huge environmental obstacles for centuries, particularly during this period, that are put in place that prevent the type of flourishing that was seen on the continent and even in Britain. I'm curious as to your thoughts of that.
Well, it's funny that you actually say that, because for a long time in the early medieval period, Ireland was known as the land of saints and scholars, and it was seen as a home for education and learning. And foreign nobles would send over their children to Ireland to learn under the monks and learn how to read Latin and such. So when the England first invaded, there was not that great a divide in technology or styles of architecture. But with the continual losses and with increasing English power over Ireland, and with this growing class divide, which also splits along religious lines, education becomes worse and worse and worse for the Irish Catholics. So you could almost say that under English rule there is a clear downward slope in knowledge, education and freedom of choice in Ireland for the Irish. And even during the Enlightenment period, as you said, there aren't many Irish intellectuals. There probably are very few. Or those that are able to live in England, such as Jonathan Swift, who wrote A Modest Proposal. But at the time, Ireland itself is starved of any real intellectual sources besides the English upper class. And most certainly in the 18th century, you can divide Ireland pretty much into three main classes. You have the Irish tenant farmer, the middleman, who would be the agent who lived in Ireland and actually collected tax and the costs of having to rent land from your English overlord. And then there would be the landowner himself, who was generally absentee and left his middleman in Ireland while he himself lived in England. There are exceptions to this, of course, like tradesmen and such. But overall, this was the main class system of Ireland at the time. And it's very, very distinctly split along religious lines, very distinctly split along ethnicity lines, and even things like education split very clearly here as well.
And this obviously creates a precedent downwards of centuries that really halted real possibilities of progress that, had many of these things not happened, probably would have taken place to the same degree as elsewhere in Europe.
Most certainly. I mean, the fact is that because of these methods, it gave England a large amount of control at the time and over time, and let them do with Ireland as they willed. But obviously most of the people weren't able to provide any knowledge to the Enlightenment. And I'm not one for speculation, but you could make the case that you might have lost a few possible world changers there, or amazing poets and artists. But that is just speculation, as I said. It's one way or the other, it's impossible to know.
No. Now,
but
regarding the
yes?
infamy of Cromwell specifically, he... obviously, once again, we're moving into territory of bias, but there are some historians who would describe Cromwell, at the very least, in the context of Ireland, as a mass murderer, if not a perpetrator of genocide.
You could definitely make the argument that as time passes, the English get more genocidal in their treatment of Ireland. Cromwell being genocidal, I think, is a fair statement. Because he is extremely draconian in his methods of instilling control, and he kills a lot of people with things like hanging, and in the battles themselves in that that rebellion. And even things like tarring and feathering, where you dump hot tar on someone and then cover them with feathers. These all come from Cromwell's methods at the time. I think it is fair to say it's genocidal, but I mean, from the English perspective, you have a country that you need to control because it's right next to you, and now they hate you because of past behaviour, and you have numerous enemies alongside you. So Ireland is a very attractive target for any enemy of England. And in fact, England's methods of draconian control have only resulted in creating a perfect striking point against it for anyone who is able to give Ireland supplies. So I could understand why people might make the case that Cromwell wasn't evil and he did what he had to do, because losing control of Ireland at this point would not be ideal. But the fact remains that his methods were extremely brutal even for the time. And you see these being carried forward to the famine as well, where it's less English intervention, it's more the English just let it happen.
Yeah, and this is what I've read whenever I read up on the subject, that there was a kind of, at the time when there were two major famines, if I recall correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you are the Irishman, not I.
What time?
The first famine, if I recall, was in the major famine was, I believe, in the 18th century, and there was then the other one that occurred in the 19th, right?
Well, the 19th century doesn't really. The biggest famine happens in 1843, which goes on until
right.
That's the Great Irish Famine.
But there were issues prior in terms of hunger and what have you. And I, once again, I'm not sure which period precisely, and certainly during the Great Famine, or the largest one. There seemed to be, because by then the British Empire had been well established throughout the world, you could argue it was close to its height of power by the mid-19th century. And there's a kind of, from what I've read of the history, a kind of moral discussion going on amongst the English. Because as you pointed out, the devastation of the famine obviously is due to the physiological issues going on with the potato plant and the soil, obviously, but the lack of intervention on the part of the English and their complete disregard for the plight of the people in Ireland, and who, in fact, I've seen arguments made that many lives could have been saved had the British Empire intervened through supplies, food, monetarily perhaps, and that much, if not most, of this might have been preventable in terms of death and destruction, immigration, etc. Had the British had a different moral compass regarding the Irish and done these things, and there was actually at the time, from what I've read, some kind of discussion going on concerning this matter.
Well, it's interesting that you put it like that, because you have to consider Ireland is an island, so it's surrounded by fish on all sides. And yet, during the famine, despite having a food source like this, which could be traded inwards, and despite the fact you would have people raising cows and such to sell, the Irish are dying off. Yeah. And the fact is that, how is that happening in a country which has been focused almost entirely on agriculture for years and is surrounded by waters with fish in them, like many fish you could try and get and eat? And the fact is that the famine, it happens because of blight, which is a particular kind of fungus that attacks potatoes not only in Ireland and elsewhere, and was particularly bad one summer in 1843, if I believe correctly.
Yeah, I mean, there was a European potato failure that occurred throughout Northern Europe, if I recall, in addition to the specifics of
But there's a number of things that led up to this. One of these would have been the tenant system itself, which was a father, instead of giving his entire farm to one son, would instead split it between his sons. So over time, because of this subdivision, farms get smaller and smaller and smaller, and more inefficient. But because of this, the English landlords suggested to the Irish to use potatoes, because even with small amounts of land, potatoes are very easy to grow. They provide most of the nutrients a human needs, and they can be grown quite easily, so you will still have an excess to sell. But when the blight happens, just wipes out the potato stock. And this isn't so bad for the first year because there's still animals being hunted down. There's still a few remnants of the potatoes left over that weren't planted. But then the next year of the famine occurs, and that's when things get particularly bad because it's not that food decreases; it's access to food decreases. The Irish tenant farmer class is too poor to really pay for things like carrots, to pay for meat, to pay for any of the food that was available in Ireland at that time. I mean, even alternate vegetables would have been too much. And even if you could, due to the fact that you've been subdividing, your farm is very, very small, so it's hard for you to support it. And at this time, many Irish farmers used to supplement their pay by working as labourers on other farms. But obviously that doesn't work either now because most of the farms have had their crops wiped out. So you have a massive unemployed group in Ireland who have no education due to the laws that have been instituted by the English. They've no crops to work with now because their farms are too small to support them because this has been allowed to happen by the landlords who have been supervising this whole thing, just letting it spin out of control. You have no access to crops to even try and grow because, again, you're too poor to get any. And you have nowhere to labour either because your neighbour is suffering the same issues. So England, to be fair, tries a number of ill-advised systems to stop this. Some soup kitchens open up in Ireland. These would have had people packed into them one bowl of soup after waiting for 4 or 5 hours, let's say. You have public works being opened, such as fixing and repairing roads, but obviously manual labour is not ideal to people who are starving to death and are now starting to pick up diseases because obviously mass starvation leads to disease. And then you have workhouses opening up as well, where people could basically intern themselves inside and they would have to do a particular task like stitch blankets or work with machines. You would stay in the poorhouse and you'd eat, you would be paid in food essentially. So not only is the famine occurring, but you could argue the Irish are being maneuvered into very, very poor conditions of work and labour for a pittance of food. So you could almost say they're using it to help enslave the Irish at the time by putting them in these awful conditions with very little payment, while being aware that these tight conditions could lead to more disease. And it's true, as you said, there is a moral dialogue happening in England at times. Because not only do you have Irish writers commenting on this, but you have people outside of England and Ireland who are looking in and are trying to send help or welfare. To my knowledge, an African nation actually tried to send food to Irish during the famine during this period. Tried to send food to Ireland during the famine in this period. And all of these attempts at foreign aid were rejected or stymied by the English, who had a very laissez-faire attitude to this. They thought if they let the famine happen, it would naturally sort itself out. But in fact, what this leads to is essentially a man-made famine caused by the English. And you could argue this is for genocidal methods. And even the English themselves, a number of English lords come out and say, this is utterly immoral. I mean, we're basically allowing this famine to happen because our only actual solutions we've offered is let it sort itself out, or while you're starving to death, you can work for a bit of food for your daughter. And you talked about Cromwell earlier, but this time period also, you get a number of, even to this day, very famous, very well-known songs in Ireland about the plight of the poor Irish labourer trying to support his family during this time period. And it really enters into the Irish cultural context of how deep a betrayal this is. And in fact, you could even say the famine leads directly to Home Rule, which is the start of Irish independence.
And on top of that, Corsica, I should mention, as you well know, perhaps the audience does not, that the Great Famine, the potato blight, one of the major contributing factors to the destruction of, I think it's almost inarguable, Gaelic culture and language per se. Because not only do you have people dying, but you have mass immigration outside of Ireland to places where the language is more or less poorly preserved. As you know, in the Pale and the Dublin area, basically in the East Coast, amongst wealthier people, sort of Anglo-Irish types, they don't favor that at all. But who were the speakers of Irish? They were primarily these poor types, and it really, based on my understanding of the history, is the beginning of the end of in some sense, the native Irish culture, or at the very least, sort of the beginning of decay. And it's something that you could point out, and we'll get into this, obviously, that in the current year, you're still feeling the effects of this.
You could argue it's even before that, because as I mentioned earlier with the hedge schools, one thing that would have been illegalized is the Irish language as well. So the Irish language was really only surviving at this point, along with Irish myths and such, not only in textbooks, which would have been locked out of the hands of the common Irish people, but also from word of mouth, from older generations to younger. So the dysphoria that's caused by the famine, with people having to leave and people dying off, there's a definite hit to Gaelic culture there. And for instance, the current Irish population now is about 4 million.
Yeah.
And around the time of the famine, it was anywhere from 6 million to 8 million, debatably. So you get a massive dying off of people, a huge loss of life and population. And this obviously impacts the culture itself, not only in the songs that are sung, but also that the Irish slowly start leaning more and more. They start going more for pragmatism than sticking to their culture and nationalism. So you see people slowly drifting into just speaking English, and the Irish language itself being lost. But this is also one of the reasons why home rule crops up as a concept. Because one thing that's notable is I mentioned the rebellion of Wolfe Tone earlier, which is about 1798. Now from that point onwards to past the famine, Ireland is under home rule, so there is no way for Ireland. No, Ireland isn't even under home rule. Ireland has no government at this point. It is controlled all from England. There is no Irish Parliament. There is no actual Irish person or Irish government that is speaking on Irish issues from an Irish perspective. So you could argue this is one of the reasons why the famine itself went so badly, and this is why home rule as a concept, the idea of having two parliaments, one in Ireland, one in England, starts gaining more popularity, because people are saying the English probably weren't aware of how bad this was. And the fact is, this is far less likely to have happened if we were able to self-govern, if we were able to self-rule. This is also when people start discussing things like the GAA, which is the Gaelic Athletics Association. And that starts supporting old Irish sports like hurling or Gaelic football. And this is closely tied to the Irish language movements at the time, which try to pop up again. Obviously, they fail given Ireland's current state. But after the famine, you get this slow, steady... The frustrations from it, instead of just leading to rebellions and conflicts, lead to the Irish trying to re-establish their own culture through peaceful methods. And this is... I haven't seen this happen in many other countries. I think it happened in Ireland in particular due to a combination of how frequently we had rebelled and how badly it had gone each time. So at this point, the Irish are getting a little defeatist in, will we ever be free from England? But also the fact that the famine is such a massive mismanagement of resources. I think many Irish people at the time convinced themselves that this couldn't have been man-made in any way. This just shows that we need to be able to govern ourselves. And they never even possibly attributed it to English malice, so to speak.
Yeah, and of course, It's a pretty important topic, the so-called Gaeltacht, and basically a product of years of these policies, the famine, where you end up in a situation where, more or less, with a few exceptions, there are pockets of native Irish speakers in various parts of the west coast, Donegal, the Dingle Peninsula, Connemara. I believe there's a pocket in Munster, I think, Muskerry.
Cape Clear.
Yeah. But I mean, this is a direct product, or the state of affairs with regards to the Irish language of this history, and the fact that it's kind of, well, it's kind of a. I've always, well, what I find so fascinating is, here I am conversing with a young Irishman, and Irish is not really your native language, and it's a strange paradox of history, a tragedy of history. And we've talked about this privately, but because it seems to me that language is key to cultural integrity in a lot of ways. It's not to say that there isn't a robust Anglo-Irish tradition. You can see it in Joyce, for example, but that something was permanently stripped away from the nationhood, the identity of the Irishman, and as you pointed out, pragmatism became ascendant. I've seen this in other parts of the world. So in the Outer Hebrides off the northwest coast of Scotland, this was in the late 90s already, and it's probably dead by now, maybe, where people spoke Scots Gaelic. The young people who couldn't find work just saying, fuck it, I'm just going to go to the mainland, basically, for work, things like that. I mean, you're, I guess, very pragmatic yourself in many ways, but surely you would agree that in some very core way, Ireland lost something that was integral to its identity.
There's a very famous Irish freedom fighter by the name of Padraig Pearse, and he came up with the phrase "Tír gan anam, tír gan teanga," which is a country without a language is a country without a soul.
Yeah.
And personally, I can't agree with that, and I still don't agree with that. Now, I acknowledge that languages are very important to cultures because it's how you express your culture. But if your culture is so fragile that if you strip away one aspect of it, like language, then I would say it was never really a stable culture in the first place. I mean, there's more to being Irish than our language. True, our language even now slips into the common vernacular. And I am ever so grateful that it is quite possible in Ireland to live your life entirely true Irish if you so choose. There are labels and signs in Irish in every single part of the cities we live in. But more than that, we still have... Irish art, funnily enough, still has many of the same things that it did even back from the Mythic era. Like, even now, a lot of the humour and a lot of the styles tend to be quite tragic and very, very depressive. And that's something that's very uniquely Irish, that kind of melancholy and that sarcasm and that depression.
I know we talked about this. I, as someone who's traveled years ago extensively through Ireland and wants to sort of revisit that experience, one of the things that is always fascinating me about Ireland and from a experiential perspective, having been there, is when you're aware of the history to some degree of the place, that there is that melancholy in the air. It's something that's not really replicable. Sure, you can visit other places and there's that too, but maybe one of the reasons why I find Ireland so attractive is that sense of loss that is embedded in the history. And yeah, I mean, whether you agree with the thesis that a country without a language is that, whether it's true or not, even the fact that everything's bilingual and yet almost artificially so reinforces that. the fact that I've met Irish people who complain about, is it not what, a 12-year curriculum where you have to study Irish in school?
Yes, there is.
Who just, I've met them, what's the fucking point? That's what they say. And there's just something that I can appreciate as an outsider, having been to Ireland and interacted with Irish people, that really does make it unique. It's not the landscape per se, it's not the lakes, the details, the castles, I mean, that's all there, but it's how the history interacts with that environment, which makes Ireland a very unique place, and a place where you can, if you really look for it, the melancholy is palpable in the air. That's my feeling, at least.
I can't think of a single Irish song or play or writer who ever doesn't end up incredibly depressive as time passes. Yeah. It's almost shocking, the consistency of it, and I can't help but wonder if there's a genetic predisposition towards that, or if it's something that, due to the conflicts with England over time, slowly built itself into our DNA epigenetically.
Well, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, as you just pointed out.
Of course, yeah. So. It's interesting just how consistent it is. But it's also, I would agree with you that we definitely had something stripped from us. But I would disagree with the fact that implies that our culture is dead or dying, or I would say our culture is more evolving. It's definitely changing, but it's still very much ours. And even in the modern world, it still exists. I mean, I can think of Irish artists now, such as comedians that are popular at the moment. We have, in recent years even, we've had our own attempt at data coming from the Rubber Bandits, who have been talking a lot about mental health issues in Ireland at the moment and stuff like that. So there is still a culture there, but it has definitely evolved. And we definitely had that Gaelic language component of our culture stripped away from us. And I think even with Irish education now, it's not that we couldn't get that back, it's just the way we're going about it is just awful. Because it feels like an obligation at this point. And no child...
You wouldn't favor jettisoning that, would you?
I would never, ever, ever favor jettisoning the Irish language. I would want them to rework the current system, but it is most certainly important to me that we try and keep it. I mean, there's a difference between something slowly dying out and then switching off the plug, so to speak.
And so as we move forward towards the rise of Irish republicanism, and eventually, independence, and I mean, you basically depicted all these events that have led up to a state of mind for the nation, and one that was ready and ripe for independence from the crown.
Well, it's actually funny that you say ready and ripe, because at 1870, I would say 1870 post-famine, is the real point where modern Irish history starts. And it starts with the Home Rule Party, which is one of the most ineffective, bloated, useless political parties that ever existed, because they had a weak leader who at the time was unwilling to get into harsh conflicts with William Gladstone. The Irish thought they should conduct themselves in a gentlemanly manner, be nice and polite and professional, and eventually England would listen to their issues. This isn't true, obviously, because we all know politics is full of the largest amount of snakes, bastards, and cunts you could ever think of. So instead, the gentlemen just get completely fucking walked over. And this continues on for about 2 years or so, until a man called Charles Stewart Parnell appears. Now, Charles Stewart Parnell is interesting because he's actually from an English background, but he's been raised in Ireland. And maybe it's that particular depressive air you were talking about, or that atmosphere. But Charles Stewart Parnell is quite sympathetic towards the Irish causes. And while he is while he does believe in the union between Ireland and England, he thinks Ireland should have home rule. That is, the Irish should manage their own internal domestic affairs and England could manage foreign affairs. So he changes the party dramatically, and he does this through a number of ways, such as if you voted against what he said the party was going to do, you would be kicked out and replaced. He decided that the Irish would start acting in absenteeism. That is, they would no longer attend the government in England. They would no longer attend the Parliament, and instead they would stay out as a constant reminder of how the English were not listening to the Irish. And of course this means that seats are lost, and it's just a thorn in England's paw. But also he looks towards unconventional tactics such as boycotting, which was actually invented by Charles Stewart Parnell, and the concept was if you did anything in your community which went against the goals of home rule, people would just not associate with you. You would be left out on your own. People wouldn't talk to you. People wouldn't work with you when you were trying to buy things from them. So it was a huge stigma at the time. It was quite an effective tool that you will see rise up in left-leaning and socialist movements after this. And this also continues into the land war, which is where Charles Stewart Parnell was like, okay, home rule doesn't interest most people in Ireland at the moment because obviously people are more concerned with land. So we'll have to sort out the question of land distribution before we move forward into something more higher-minded. Because the best way to get through a man's head is through his stomach. So he associates with a number of socialist or very far left-leaning Irish people at the time, Irish men. And they start not exactly rioting, but holding protests and large public speeches talking about the injustice of the fact that a tenant farmer could rent a farm for 6 years, and he could spend 5 years of those 6 improving the farm, adding new facilities and such. And if his landlord got tired of him, he could just remove his tenant status, kick him off the farm, and that tenant farmer would not be compensated for any improvements made over the 5-year period. So there was no real incentive for the Irish to try and improve their farms either. But also the fact was that the landlords owed the tenant farmer nothing, could set rates as they want. Rack renting was very common, where you'd set rent which was simply too high to expect. The farmer couldn't pay it, kick him off the farm very easily. So the land war is intended to basically, we'll make Irish tenant farming much more fair. And it works to a degree in that, because Charles Stewart Parnell, he isn't actually obsessed with this goal, and he doesn't want to turn the Irish 100% towards a socialist feel, or he doesn't want to cause a massive class division between tenant farmers and landlords. So he lets himself get thrown in jail by William Gladstone, because Gladstone is unsure how to react to this movement. It's obviously bad, but they weren't breaking any clear legal laws. So when Charles Stewart Parnell finally breaks a law by holding another protest after they've been outlawed, not only does this make Gladstone look bad, but it means that when the movement starts to fail, as Charles Stewart Parnell is hoping it will, he'll be in jail and he'll be unaffiliated with it. So when he comes back out into the public, they'll all be quite interested in what he has to say, and he can set the mandate for taking down home rule. But an issue happens in that he gets embroiled in a controversy because he cheats on... He basically has sex with another man's wife for a long period of time. And he cuckolds the poor guy. This is obviously goes very against the strong Catholic vibe of Ireland. And he's essentially cast out, and Home Rule is left in a massive, horrible state of affairs because Charles Stewart Parnell does not willingly step down. So the party splits between him and his loyalists, and then he further degenerates down the road, and he eventually dies off. And what was once a very strong movement for equality and freedom of self-determination in Ireland is now a quagmire of backstabbing and internal strife. But this eventually gives rise to Sinn Féin, which was a party inspired by Home Rule, was actually more conservative than Home Rule. And they start trying to get interest in it again. But not only that, the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, they have been slowly growing in influence since the time of Wolfe Tone, who I mentioned all the way back in 1798. And Wolfe Tone is the IRB are staunch Irish nationalists. They want Ireland completely free from England.
If I recall, Sinn Féin stand in English would be something like ourselves or we ourselves.
We ourselves, that is correct. Yeah. We ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a nice label, but the fact is that politically, Ireland is still quite limpid. It's not very driven or motive still, because you've had this massive crack in the public perception of Irish politics with Charles Stewart Parnell. So people are only starting to get interested in it a little again. This obviously frustrates the IRB though, who they didn't want Home Rule because they saw it as a half measure, but they saw it as a means to an end. So seeing this delay has upset a few of their plans, and it frustrates them into action. So I could go into a lot of detail with this, but essentially, I mentioned a man earlier, Padraig Pearse. Padraig Pearse, James O'Connell, Countess Markovich, God, I can't say her name, very complicated, and Eamon de Valera, and a number of other Irish nationalists. They come together and they start planning to form an uprising, to start an uprising. And they do this to one of two methods. One was, because of Home Rule, and the fact it was seeming likely, you had Northern Ireland, Ulster, getting quite panicky about this, because obviously they've now spent the past 200 years or so as Protestants, and they see themselves as English, so they don't want Home Rule. The slogan "Home Rule is Rome Rule" is very common here. So because of that, they create a military force known as the Ulster Voluntary Defence Force, or the UVF. And they said basically, we're not going to let you get Home Rule, and we're not going to let you enforce Rome Rule on us in the north. We're not going to be governed by the Irish in the south. This obviously causes problems, so you have the Irish Volunteer Force, or the IVF, start to crop up. Now, Padraig Pearse and the IRB, the guys who are planning this whole uprising, they know that they themselves aren't very popular in Ireland, and they aren't a well-known movement. They aren't big anymore. So instead their plan was they were going to hijack the IVF. And right around this time, about 1910s, you have the First World War brewing. And so, over a 1 to 2 year period, from 1915, let's say, to 1916, the IRB starts trying to infiltrate the Irish Volunteer Force for a larger military unit, and they start trying to get into contact with the Germans who are currently at war with the English to get guns from abroad. Now, once again, however, there's leaks, because every time an Irish rebellion happens, there's obviously a leak. Because fuck us. Anyway. The ammunition drop, which was planned with a German ship coming in to deliver fuel and supplies to the Irish, gets caught by the English. The IVF, who until this point had been fed a careful series of letters to trick them into a mindset where they think the English are going to outlaw them, become aware that Padraig Pearse and the IRB are essentially tricking them and lying to them. So this is what leads to the Easter Rising of 1916, because the heads of the IRB, the heads of the IRA at the time, you could say, realize that they aren't going to get the big movement that they want. They can't seize England at this point. They have too few men and too few guns. So instead, James Connolly and a number of them decide we'll stage a heroic, defiant last stand against the British in Dublin. We'll probably all die, but it will look really, really good. And hopefully it'll inspire some people. And the funny thing is, it actually does the exact opposite, because the Easter Rising lasts 7 days. They seize the General Post Office in Dublin. They seize a barracks and a number of other important locations with very few men. And when the Proclamation of Independence is read out in Dublin City, people at first assume it's a joke. And then they start reacting very hatefully, because the gunfire and the destruction in Dublin that happens, especially when the Brits bring up a gunboat up the river in Dublin, is blamed solely on the Irish nationalists, and they're depicted as terrorists and completely unreasonable, and the British were so nice to us, they were going to give us home rule. How could this ever happen? This is disgusting. You're absolute pieces of shit. And the British completely misread this situation, because they think, oh my god, we almost had another rebellion again in the middle of a war. This is really, really bad. The best way to deal with this is obviously overwhelming force. So they actually end up executing most of the leaders of the movement after 7 days of bloodshed and destruction and chaos in the capital of Ireland, with civilians able to watch their own countrymen getting gunned down by British employed soldiers, or British soldiers in certain cases. So this leads to a change in tone, especially with the tragic death of James Connolly, who was shot in the GPO and survived 2 days to meet with his wife and children, only to be executed then by firing squad. And suddenly the entirety of Ireland changes overnight. You can see this in the poetry of people like W.B. Yeats. You can see this in the writing at the time. A nationalistic spirit is born because of 1916. Because people are once again firmly reminded that the British are apart from us. And they really, despite their proclamations of beneficence and being kind and caring, really they will just resort to bloody, brutal methods when necessary. So obviously the Irish are like, you know what, fuck home, we're Sinn Féin, because, very funny actually, the rising is called the Sinn Féin Rising. So a lot of people associated with that very milquetoast, watered down version of home rule.
I ask you a question pertaining to this. I'm familiar with this, most at least the basics of what you're talking about. How much do you know about outside of Ireland, within the confines of England, how the English public or the educated public received this degree of brutality and how they perceived it to be? Do you think that had any impact on, in terms of Britain's policy henceforth? Or?
Well, the thing is that Britain at the time wasn't really concerned with Ireland, because this is 1916, middle of the First World War. The British people are more focused in a jingoistic dick measuring contest with the Germans. So they probably did notice this method, but they wouldn't have considered it brutal themselves, because even when something is a town or a city away, it's a lot easier to not take seriously. You know, for generations they've been brought up about how the Irish are parasites or inferior, or, you know, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, this kind of attitude. percolates England to a degree. The Irish aren't treated well over there. So they wouldn't have reacted very strongly to these executions. In fact, they probably would have seen it as justified in most cases, because ultimately these men were still terrorists and they were threatening the English state, and they did get into contact with the German forces at the time. So I don't think England would have reacted very strongly to this. They may have disapproved, especially of James Connolly, but as a whole, this is pretty much just putting down on our rebellion. But what this leads to is that already Ireland was going through a kind of cultural revolution after Charles Stewart Parnell died, because while the politics kind of dipped after his cheating and his death, you'd see the cultural aspect of Ireland only grew. And that's how figures like the IRB got involved with the IRB through cultural groups and, relearning Irish culture. Plays from long ago were being translated. Irish was starting to enter the vernacular again. And this is because of this, because you have this national tragedy and this reawakening of cultural pride. It's a good it's good kindling for a rebellion to grow from, which is why you don't even have to wait very long. It's about 4 years later, I think, where the War for Independence comes. Let me check. And the War for Independence is also interesting because it leads to a lot of the tactics. 1990 to 1921, so 3 years. And the War for Independence is interesting because it serves as a model for future guerrilla warfare incidents. I mean, it's not a very exciting war to study because it's mostly just Irish groups, Irish flying troops they would have been called, attacking English barracks, killing people there. And then you would have the Black and Tans, or the auxiliaries, who were retired English soldiers or retired English army officers brought back into the military as an informal police force. And they were essentially let loose in Ireland. And due to things like PTSD, the fact that some of them may have been associated with criminal activities, there's a lot of violence there. Bloody Sunday in particular is probably the worst atrocity that comes from the Irish War for Independence. And that's when the Black and Tans drive an APC into the middle of a Gaelic football match in a GAA stadium, and they open fire on some of the crowd. They kill like 11 people. It's very shocking considering the fact that right now the Irish conflict, even 1916, the 7-day rebellion, this isn't huge to the rest of the world because World War II was happening. World War I was happening. But afterwards, in this 1919-1921 period, a year after the war, not only do you have the British, who are tired and sick and worn out with conflicts, but you have the French and you have the Americans and you have all different viewpoints from around the world looking at England. And right now, England is seen as the oppressor of a small nation which has been for centuries marginalized and brutally abused, and everyone knows about the famine. So it's a really, really bad look for England. And not only that, because the Irish are resorting to guerrilla warfare tactics, there's no real quick way for the English to end this war. So their only real solutions are they can send over more men, which will make them look terribly in the public space, but they will win. Or they can just let this quagmire go on and on and on and on, and these problems of bad optics abroad and the Irish getting guns and attacking barracks more and more frequently, which is what eventually brings the English to the plate. It wasn't that we outfought them, it was simply the optics of the situation were too bad for the British to continue, in their post-World War I state.
Now, we probably should. I do want to ask something pertinent to this. We have to actually, I guess you could say, historically in the timeline, achieve independence before I ask the question. So I'll just let you continue.
So, the Civil War, the War for Independence eventually gets settled in 1921 when a delegation of Irish politicians go over to England. I could go into some detail in this, but frankly it's unnecessary because it can really all be summed up in that Michael Collins signs a deal with England which says that there is an Irish Free State. We cannot have the North Ulster back. And we do have some control of our country, but not all. It's better than home rule ever would have been, but it's not national freedom. And this leads to, considering the fact at this point we've about 400 years of hatred and sectarian conflict and war and rebellions and atrocities, the fact that this final document, the settlement of the Irish question, is a compromise, does not sit well with the more radical Irish elements, more radical nationalistic elements. So then, immediately, almost a year later, I would say, an Irish Civil War happens. And it's pretty much the exact same as the War for Independence, except now it's two different factions trying to do guerrilla warfare against each other. Because you have the Irish Free State, which is supported by England and has more finances and resources. And they know the tricks of you could say, the Irish, what's a good term? Irish nationalists. We'll just go with Irish nationalists. With the nationalists. But the nationalists are more willing to do extreme tactics, and it's easier for them to do guerrilla tactics as well, because obviously they're the disenfranchised groups. It's much easier to mount away. But this goes on until the death of Michael Collins, and then from there, this is where you see Ireland, after Michael Collins dies, Eamon de Valera and the nationalists, they fold, they concede, they say, look, we're not going to continue this war anymore, you just go it yourself. And so they separate, and they just go dark for a while, and so the Irish provisional state is left to truck along. And this is the last real big cultural conflict with England in the rest of Ireland. But Northern Ireland to this day is still very much a hotbed for conflict. I wouldn't say very violent or armed conflict every single day, but there's definite tensions there.
Yeah, well, as you know, I talked to Jabba about that reasonably extensively. He offered his own perspective, but I think it's uncontentious, or not contentious rather, that to this day, armed or not, violent or not, people don't necessarily get along there.
I would still say armed and violent, but I would say that those are generally the exceptions to the rule. It's likely the provisionals do still have access to guns because they're effectively drug dealers now. In many cases, they use drugs to finance themselves. So obviously you'll need heavier artillery, such as assault rifles and such for that. But most conflict up there, it's definitely not gun related, but I would say it could still be violent. I can't honestly assess because I'm from the south of Ireland myself, and I wouldn't want to comment.
But even in the Republic, and this is kind of the question, or I guess the thoughts I'd put out there, in my experience dealing historically, particularly even in the 90s, as recently as the 90s, there still existed some degree of resentment, ire, just sort of a distaste for the English. That, in my observation, these days has largely dissipated. In the Republic, of course. I'm not referring to Northern Ireland. And It's.
I'd actually disagree with that.
Oh, please, because I'm not living in Ireland. I don't live in Ireland, but it's based on my interactions with people.
You may be aware that in 2011 the British Queen came to visit Ireland.
Yeah, vaguely I can recall that. Oh.
There were actually concerns that there would be assassination attempts against her. And there was a lot of protesting, like even in the city. I'm actually sitting in the same place where I was there about 7 years ago right now. And on the opposite side of the bridge where I was, there was an entire protest, about 200, 300 people, with flags all screaming about fuck the Queen, essentially. And we want our 6 counties back. We want Ireland to be whole again. So that tension still very much exists. I mean, even making a black and tans joke in the wrong pub is a very questionable and a very insulting thing to say.
Fair enough, but I mean, and perhaps you're obviously quite a remarkable individual in this a special case, but you don't seem, you're perhaps far too rational to just project a kind of jingoistic hostility towards the English, but I imagine amongst your countrymen, those not of your caliber, that kind of visceral reaction might be more present, is what you're suggesting.
I would say it's still very much there. It depends on the family, really. I mean, in demographics wise, the further south in Ireland you go, the more nationalistic and more anti-British it tends to get. Because Munster was always known as the rebel province. And that's because even historically, I mentioned the Earls earlier, the last place that was free from English rule was Munster. So there has always been a very strong anti-English aspect in Munster. Now, that does not mean that if they come into contact with an English person, people in Munster cannot be cordial. But if there's any bit of social lubrication, you can see jokes like that starting to come out. And anytime you can safely displace that dislike, like in sports or anything where there's a competitive aspect to it, you can see elements of that coming out again. I mean, one of the most popular songs we sing is Fields of Athenry, and that is a song from the Famine about Irish labourer being sent off to die to Australia because he had to steal food to support his family because his English landlord was a cunt. So it's everywhere in the culture. It's very hard to escape. It's not incredibly extreme, but any chance it can come out in, it does. It's not the default, if you get my drift.
Yeah. I wonder then if the interactions I've had largely been based on a charade of sorts, and where people are sort of feigning friendliness, but the reality is there still is that visceral reaction to the English.
I could be biased in this, as I said, I'm from the south of Ireland myself.
Yeah, but yourself, you're not the type to be consumed by irrational hatred, so it's,
Well, it's quite rational if you look at it from another aspect. It was a long time under their control. That's going to leave marks, but even our culture itself...
Well, I shouldn't use the word irrational. I mean, it's rational in the sense that there's a kind of a logic to it. But it all goes back. I mean, this is, I guess, the really pertinent question that supersedes the IQ, the Irish question, or the English question, however you want to put it. But this idea that how long must the red hot coals of nationalistic resentment and anger burn until it's no longer an issue? And
it's deeper than that, I think. Really, what you're asking is less a question of nationalistic, and it's more about racism. And the fact is, I don't think racism does die or dissipate over time. Because hate in general needs a release valve. And the fact is that until that history is rectified, It's always there. It is always an open wound. Even with any disenfranchised state or any group that has been disenfranchised, they don't let go of what happened in the past. This is almost universal in my experience from what I've seen. And with the Irish especially, because it's so long and our culture is so pervaded by it, it's a lot harder to release. But I mean, for another example, think about how much Black American culture is defined by their conflict with white people. And think about how that's not only a racial thing, it's a geographic thing, it's an economic thing. All of that impacted Ireland as well. So you have all of that. You also have sectarianism. And it's definitely, because Ireland is free, and because we've been free for so long, it's nowhere near as, let's say, you could argue the question has already been answered to a degree. Because it's nowhere near as intense in Ireland anymore, because we've got pretty much most of what we want. But there's still people, for instance, who won't be happy until we have the 6 counties in the north back. And if that happened, then you would have people on the northern side who wouldn't be happy, because they're part of a people that they don't see as their own. So as I said, to tie it back again, much, much earlier with the plantation question, the plantation was almost too successful in Ireland, because now it has ensured no matter what, there will be racial hatred and tension in Ireland.
Yeah, and this kind of links in nicely, for a long time throughout the British Isles, as well as Ireland, it was easy to operate off of these long-standing, let's call them, I guess, racial hatreds, although I'm being fucking autistic here, but
ethnicity.
Because that's probably a better description. I don't really think modern Irish people are all that distant from. I have to look at things like FST distance, but I mean that's so ethnicity is better. Sort of ethnic hatred and conflict. That was easy to sort of let fester, and there is good logical justification for it in many ways. But now, possibly we've discussed this a bit, with a minor exception of Ireland, there's a new kind of ethnic threat in Europe. Specifically, talking about the masses of so-called brown-skinned people, as well as Muslims. Well, they tend to be that, but basically the non-Europeans. And it seems that people who are increasingly of nationalist bent or alt-right, or however you want to term them, are willing to set aside, at least for the nonce, these historical ethnic conflicts for the sake of a kind of loose alliance or loose sense of harmony to push back the we could say theoretical invader, actual invader, I don't really know. Ireland seems, as you pointed out, to not have so much of a Muslim problem. You do have a lot of Central and Eastern Europeans, Poles and what have you, relatively speaking, working there. First, my question would be, what is the perception, in your view, of, you could say, EU migrants, that is, proper Europeans from within the European Union, particularly Eastern Europeans, Central Europeans, and then, following that, the question regarding the Muslim invasion?
This is a very easy question to answer, because the best response I could come up with, the Irish position is entirely hypocritical on this. And that's because a lot of people in Ireland will argue the point that we ourselves were migrants, we went abroad to other countries, we became a part of those countries, ergo it would be incredibly hypocritical for us not to do this. But the fact remains is that the Irish have not taken many, if any, Muslims in from this crisis. They haven't taken in many Syrians, to my knowledge. They haven't taken in many Afghanis. You could argue a part of this is due to our relatively small population. I mean, 4 million people is not a lot in the grand scheme of this world. But it's also because the fact is Ireland is too too obsessed with what happened in the bank crisis to really focus on that. We have our own political issues at the moment. So really every politician in Ireland and every person in Ireland is quite happy to utterly ignore the migrant crisis, utterly ignore the people being affected by the migrant crisis. I mean, you yourself, you live in Germany, you're probably quite aware of those famous pictures of those young migrant children who were found drowned.
Sure.
After trying to get aboard.
It's great propaganda.
Yeah, that was the last time anyone said anything about the migrant crisis in Ireland, really. It's just, it's died a death since then, because nobody really cares, to be frank. Nobody really cares. We've had our own issues with our politicians. We've been busy sorting that out. And as for the wider Muslim question, I would say while most people in Ireland, they act left-wing or liberal, ultimately they end up right-wing. Our two biggest political parties, for instance, are essentially the same party. Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil are almost... No, sorry, not Sinn Féin. Jesus Christ. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are essentially almost identical in the way they go about things. For instance, Fianna Fáil was the party that got us into the banking crisis and helped cause the collapse of 2008. Fine Gael was the party that followed afterwards and has since then ruled in Ireland for about 10 years. But the way they got us out of that damn recession, that whole thing, was by following a plan mandated by Fianna Fáil. So essentially you've just had one party steal another party's tactics, and it's been the exact same, because they're pretty much identical.
What would be the perception of someone like Leo Varadkar, who's not Irish, at least ethnically, not entirely?
Well, he's not ethnically Irish, but he expresses those Irish values we all love so well, and that is hypocrisy, and he is very savvy. And Leo is a former immigrant himself. Well, his family were immigrants, but he himself is anti-immigrant. Leo is a homosexual, and yet he was against gay marriage for a long time, until it was passed as law, and then he said, okay, I'm actually gay.
But, I mean, most people don't have a problem with him and his position, despite...
No, most people don't have a problem with it. Because the fact is that despite being a foreigner, he has pretty much identical Irish values as the rest of us. And all you really want from your political leader is... Like, the issue with political leaders is not what race they're from, it's their values. It wasn't that Obama was black, it was that he had very liberal values, and he wanted to spread those...
This is a point shill for the alt-right, and then, bring up their protestations. Yeah.
Sure. Why not?
Well, I'm not alt-right, but, something along the lines of it. But race and value, and race and culture, and yada, yada, yada. So...
The brain is probably the single most complex thing we've ever discovered. We know more about the ocean floor, and we know more about space than we do about how it works in its greatest depths. And in that regard, I would say, as long as Leo is shown to follow the Irish value system, there's no reason to think that his genetics are going to suddenly change and have a massive impact on the formation of his brain. The fact is that everything he is doing is pro-Irish. Well, it depends on the class of Irish you're talking about, I guess. But everything he's doing is mostly pro-Irish. So if he was going to show a massive flip in characteristic and turn anti-Irish, he probably would have done so by now.
Surely, that's easy to agree with, but obviously you yourself have expressed, opposition. You wouldn't want the ethnic homogeneity of Ireland to be too...
despoiled.
Yeah,
I would not. Yeah. I think there's a lot of very easy arguments for that position. One being is that we know groups have in-preferences. And the fact is, the more groups you have that are similar size within an environment, the more in-preferences that can have substantial conflicts increase. So the fact is, the more people of similar group size and of similar groups I put in, the less homogenous and thus the less peaceful the environment will be. Because they'll all obviously, well, not obviously, but they'll all have their biases towards their own group, and they will all have biases against each other. And in sufficient numbers, that means this will always be less peaceful than a state that has a majority group, and then other groups tacked on as well. Not only this, I tend to find that multiculturalism, for instance, tends to skin and bone the parts of the culture it's trying to integrate it. Like Ireland, for instance, we can look at this in America. What parts of Irish culture actually survived into America?
Yeah, well,
I mean, for instance,
drinking. Yeah.
For instance, Halloween used to be called Samhain, and instead of pumpkins, we used turnips. And it was more similar to the Day of the Dead than anything else. And yet now it's all about sluts going out wearing super tight nurse outfits and little kids giving themselves obesity. So, I mean, honestly, looking at multiculturalism, it does not, in fact, sustain the cultures that it allows to come together. It takes out the most easily commercialized bits, exacerbates them, and all of the actual nuance and thought behind those practices are lost.
What about the restaurants?
Well, I mean...
Yeah,
that is a fair question.
No, is it? I don't know. I mean, it's a tongue-in-cheek. It's not a serious question, obviously. I'm not arguing. I've actually seen...
I would make the point in Ireland, we were starving too often to be good at cuisine.
Right.
So
I like a nice Irish stew. I'm not going to lie. I like that.
That's pretty much all we have.
Putnam, who did the famous 2007, well, it was compiled over a decade, but published, I think, in 2007, the sort of that study, Robert Putnam, American guy, on social cohesion. In his, funnily enough, in his discussion with somebody at NPR, which I don't know if you know that's a very, very liberal, far left sort of radio podcast, yeah. And he said something. One of the reasons he cited why, despite his findings, why diversity is such a good thing, he did cite restaurants. I'm not even kidding. He said the food, the restaurants. So this is actually an argument made by multiculturalists in some quarters, at least.
I mean, you could just take the recipes and tell them to fuck off, like.
Yeah, but then it's not authentic anymore. Behold the...
It's not authentic anyway. Come on,
I agree. The United States is peppered, for example, by so-called Japanese restaurants run by Mexicans and Latinos and Chinese. I
see that even here. Like, I see a kebab shop with no Turkish person inside.
Yeah.
Which is a sign of the end, frankly.
It's probably a good thing that you don't have a large Turkish demographic in Ireland, probably.
At the very least, you can make the case that because we are more ethnically homogenous, it makes it easier for people to integrate because they have the standard to compare themselves to. And also it means that in-group preference is a lot harder to get out of control. It may be biased one way to a degree, sure, but at the end of the day, it will still lead to more social order than if we had 50 different groups fighting over the remnants, like this is some post-apocalyptic hellhole.
Welcome to the United States, the land of restaurants and, as you taught me many moons ago, Amadans.
Amadans, yeah.
Everyone, let us make this great work of spreading the Irish word, Amadan for idiot, to the English language. May it reach the far corners of the world. May it perhaps take on the hue of the American himself as he revels in his degeneracy, his lack of culture, and his ignorance. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's without question that the United States is just it just has no culture, no, well, I mean, it has a consumerist culture that you could argue is imported or exported, but I don't really know what Americans run on increasingly.
What could have been a solution to that, you think? Like we just discussed there, how trying to integrate cultures together doesn't really work well because you tend to have all the most noticeable aspects cropping up.
Well, Yeah.
If you made a single unified culture for all these new groups, do you think that could have an effect?
Well, no, and I've raised this objection with Sargon of Mossad himself, and he just, I don't know, well, he's Sargon, what can I expect? But the objection, well, the problem there is, in order to even create a kind of unified new culture, you have to have groups of individuals who are willing to effectively slander their own culture and say, this culture isn't as good as this new proposed culture, or even in the case of so-called civic nationalism or things along those lines, the culture of whatever, Pakistan or West India or whatever it might be, is just not as good as this new culture I'm acclimating to, and so I'll forget that. And most people won't do that. There will be exceptions, there always are, but the majority of people will want to feel that connection and will not want to reject the native origins of their culture. I mean, for example, I would argue that, not universally, but in most cases, throughout history, particularly in modern 20th century and the 21st century, that and we've talked about this obviously, that Jews are not really assimilated. They're kind of pseudo-assimilated. This is because,
well, I mean, that's probably the religion itself. For instance,
it's part of the religion, but then if you watch, I can send you a link. There's a film made ironically by an Israeli guy called Defamation. That's from 2009, I think. And the guy interviews this guy who made the film, Israeli Jew, interviews the leaders of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is basically just a well-endowed.
Yes, I am familiar with their work.
Right. So, and so he follows them to Ukraine, where they're kind of negotiating with the leadership there, so as to not incite. Well, the implication is to not incite hatred due to Jewish participation in early 20th century communism vis-a-vis the Ukrainian famine, which killed there about 6 million people, and they explicitly said you can't call that a genocide. Now, there's a historical debate whether or not the Ukrainian famine was. The point is that they were interviewed. He's retired, but this guy Abe Foxman and his wife about how they connect to so-called Jewish culture. And they say something, the wife says something, well, as Abe and I and the rest of the members of ADL are not particularly religious, our main thing is basically fighting anti-Semitism, or connecting with it and looking out for it and that kind of thing. And so even in cases where there's a rejection of the religion, not all the time, but most of the time, you get
clear in-group preference.
Yeah, and even when you don't have that, you get these kind of bizarre outcroppings. I don't know if you were in the cafe, as I referred to, J. Service the other night. There's this bizarre creature that appears, a self-identified trans.
Right. We were discussing this yesterday.
Right, and this creature was also from New York, and so even didn't really affiliate with her, I don't know, its fellow tribesmen particularly, but still, in lacking that, just, well, went crazy effectively in some sense. I think, and so yeah, there are exceptions, but religious or not, this is a perfect example of the inability of a group to assimilate. And to be fair, it makes sense because you have thousands of years of history and all the Middle Age stuff, and but I would say that would be applicable to any group. So if you came from a 3,000-year-old subculture from India, and you have high regard for it, why would you say, well, American civic nationalism is much better? Screw that! I'm just going to reject that. I don't.
The issue is that you're always kicking the can down the road. Really, I mean, you can try to make a new culture to integrate people. But that doesn't mean all the people will integrate, and if you want to integrate the new people who come in, you have to remake your culture again. And this happened exactly with the Catholic Church, really. You end up reforming and remaking yourself so many times that you're nothing compared to what you were before. And there's no clear sign of this pressure, this constant change stopping. So, I mean, the fact is that inevitably, because of the way our genes are designed, because of the way altruism works in biology, you will always have this effect of Do you force them to conform, or do you conform to them and then obviously force yourself to adjust further down the road again and again and again and again?
But even the force doesn't work historically. For example, there were these so-called conversos in Spain, so-called Jews who allegedly converted to the Catholic faith. I'm not gonna pass judgment one way or another, but they weren't really believing Catholics thereafter. They still.
Sure.
It was a forceful act by and large, an act that came about through threat, punishment, basically.
Well, the thing is with peace is that you don't really need a 100% total peace, because that's impossible.
Yeah.
You just need an effective peace, enough that it is non-noticeable in everyday life. And I mean, you can try to do that with force, but it's difficult, and nowadays practically impossible. What with the internet allowing this anger and frustration to trickle out to somewhere.
Yeah, and this is why I think increasingly people don't like when I say this, but the best thing we can achieve in the current state of affairs, particularly in places like Canada or the United States and increasingly in Great Britain, is a kind of acceptable tolerance. Nobody, and this is what I've observed in the neighborhoods and the cities of Germany. I've seen big cities where it's quote unquote diverse. You know, you have certain types of Arabs here and Turks there and Germans there, and then other European, and nobody really likes each other very much, but they kind of tolerate each other's presence. I've seen this in New York to varying degrees. I've seen this in London. Well, London's a mess, but the point is that might be the highest good you can achieve these days in these so-called multicultural societies, where people aren't going to, as long as they have their sustenance, you know, they're not being deprived. They have roof, shelter, food over there.
Do you think it's a wise idea to lower the overall max happiness of a nation if you can raise the happiness individually of each person by a small percentage?
It's a very difficult question. I'll tell you why. Because the alternative, and this is where ethical concerns might come. The alternative to this sort of passable tolerance, where you don't like each other, but it's okay. You won't attack each other, is is basically the use of mass violence. Now, I don't know these days where I stand on these things, but I mean, as well, you know, Negroid Dinkelbergstein. I mean, he just says, well, yeah, why not do it? Everyone's done it in the past, and so yeah, it's just that to borrow from Enoch Powell, in order to reach that state or stage later down the line, you need to produce rivers of blood, metaphorically or otherwise. And I think obviously we still have the capacity as human beings, but I'm convinced now that unless we have an absolute state of deprivation in terms of material access, things like, well, we were talking about the famine, massive unemployment by means 30% plus, people lose their homes. The incentive to engage in that type of purge or violence, where tribalism rears its ugly or not so ugly head, depending on your perspective, and then you just got to go to town on these people. I don't think that's going to happen, and so I think de facto we're just going to have, as people who live in quote unquote multicultural societies, are going to be stuck with this sort of, well, I don't really like the Turkish guy, but whatever, I stay out of his way.
To clarify, are you saying violence of any kind will be less likely to occur, or tribalistically inspired violence? Because the fact is, with this question, I think it goes beyond just tribalistically inspired violence. It goes into concerns for the future of your nation, which you could argue stem from a tribalistic source.
Yeah.
But still are ultimately about governance and about the future. And I think, in fact, given the way the AFD and all sorts of, given the fact that Nigel Farage is pushing for a Brexit, which is Irish Brexit, and is the stupidest idea ever. But enough on that. With all these very dissident opinions forming and all these with the West, you're seeing more and more ideas are growing distant and far apart. And as that happens, it's there's more dissent and hate and dislike forming within and between them. And we see this happening democracies worldwide. More extreme elements are starting to appear, and these more extreme elements are proving quite popular with many people. So the question is really, do you think that this, if there is a spark of violence, will it be due to tribalism, or does it even need tribalism? Because, I mean, you could quite possibly facilitate a massive uprising in America by saying, proving Donald Trump actually was involved with Russia, let's say. Or if Donald Trump had proven that Hillary had fixed the election. Because he was calling for, this presidency is illegitimate before he turned out to have won. So, I mean, are we really that far from violence, do you think?
Well, I guess I should clarify. I'm not saying that tribalism is the necessary prerequisite or the sort of the gateway towards violence. You don't need specific types of tribalism to engage in violent behavior. I would agree with that. Particularly in the United States, it wouldn't need to be identifiably tribal. But let's say some hypothetical scenario that in Great Britain there's some new ascendancy of alt-righty thinkers or politicians, and they're all able to get on board with them, the general public support from white Englishmen and what have you, and they create policies to deal with quote-unquote pockies. In a context like that, it would necessarily be tribal, whereas in the United States, because the United States is so fractured to begin with, it's for half the time in the United States you don't even know what tribes somebody. I mean, there are obviously discernible tribes, various types of Latinos, they're black people, they're Jews, and then you get the sort of weird European Amerimut type. But this is an issue because what does that mean? You're just some white dude of some strange admixture, like I am. I'm some kind of weird European Amerimut. But I mean,
I just love that with Richard Spencer in particular. He's a character who talks a lot about white nationalism and white freedom, and when he does it, he seems to paint over every white culture as the same.
But it's not.
It's very funny.
The silliness, because I've talked to friends about. I mean, in a sense, is that quote unquote white Americans would unite under fucking craft beer or posh homebrewed alcoholic beverages, or I don't know. It's just in the United States. I think it's less likely you get this tribal stuff because it's just not as direct. Although I suppose in the United States, white skin might be enough in some sense. If it really comes to blows, then people could unite behind that banner. But it's not.
If there's no centralized culture, let's say, then also the requirements to bind people together would be quite low as well.
Well, yeah, there is no centralized culture apart from consumerism. So
I mean, saying just white skin alone is arguably all you'd really need, because the standards are so low.
Yeah.
What other moral or value system are you going to get behind?
That's the sales pitch of Richard Spencer. I mean, beyond the rhetoric and his immaculate suits is just whiteness, and whiteness is not. I mean, in the United States, it sounds pretty good, but I've spoken to Americans. They don't know very much about Europe. I mean, they have some vague. I mean, I'm not trying to tell my own horn. I could be much better informed, but I have no Irish ancestry, and I know Irish history better than most Irish Americans do. It's I don't know. It just doesn't seem. I mean, I guess whiteness is good enough there, but in Europe, it would have to take on a different form that has a historical basis. It is still mostly homogenous in Europe, give or take.
Well, to be frank, it would never take root in Europe anyway, because I'm pretty sure the British spent longer at the French's throats than they ever did at dealing with Islamic people or Arabs.
Yeah,
there's more cultural hatred along those lines, really. I mean, if we want to look at this point for point, while the French do have a lot more in common with the British, they've also participated in a lot more conflicts with one another. And they have allied together that is true at times, but I mean, we've also allied with Arabic and Eastern countries as well.
Yeah.
So I think realistically, in Europe, you would never get this kind of centralized alt-right vibe.
No, but what I suggested earlier, for those people who favor that sort of thing, is a kind of loose pan-European alt-righty type organization that obviously favors individual sovereignty. Most of them are EU skeptics, etc., but at the same time is not interested in rehashing, rekindling old conflicts, such as the conflict between France and England, or the Netherlands and Germany, and what have you, because they're part of some, I don't know, this would I guess be their terminology, some sort of European brotherhood or whatever.
It's kind of oxymoronic, though, really. I mean, you're trying to dig into their history to bring them together while also asking them to ignore their history when it divides them. I mean, that's not really how people think.
No, but I guess it's a question of sort of threat level. So, you know, code level, orange, yellow, red, whatever. And I think most people who are part of these movements, you know, Generation Identity in France or what, they're not. They see they see probably. Well, I mean, it's pretty consistent. I think they're basically two enemies in these two enemies of these identitarian movements, or two groups of people that are sometimes seen as coterminous or overlapping. You have this sort of the overt threat that they perceive in Islam and various people from outside of Europe, and then what they would refer to as the JQ, or the Jewish question, is pretty much uniformly the case. And so they could, if they wanted to, unite around opposition to those groups or principles, without necessarily, I mean, or even kicking the can down the line and say, well, yeah, historically there was a lot of conflict between France and Germany and France and England, but let's deal with these other folk first, and then we can deal with it if we need to, that kind of thing.
That would work well, except there's one issue with the JQ aspect, and that is the JQ is too ephemeral an idea to really unite people behind in hatred. People do well with facts and images and clear cut-out concepts.
I don't know. It worked pretty well in the 20th century in terms of inciting hatred.
That was different, though, because that wasn't so much a JQ question. That was, first of all, Germanic Jews and how they had been acting in Germany until then.
But we talked about the other night that there was an evangelical element to it that spread beyond the borders of Germany. So
sure, but what you see is you had that strong backing of the Germanic Jew element, that strong familiar element, and then you could say, and these guys are like the rest of them. They're all like this. So this is why we must hunt down and exterminate their entire peoples, because they are all like this. But nowadays with the JQ, I mean, it's, by its very nature, it's so dispersed and spread out, and you have to really hunt for the information. But when you do find the information, they're controlling your media and tricking you into slowly killing yourself. And that's bad, but it doesn't get an emotive response besides, oh, fuck them.
I would disagree. I think for hardline JQers, it becomes a kind of obsessive monocausal perspective or understanding of the world. And a lot of people can align themselves with that, and they say, well, you know, if we just solve this, most of our problems will be gone.
I mean, that is true, but those JQers are also the ones that are most inarticulate and don't seem to really grasp the nuances of what is actually being done.
True.
I mean, these are the guys in the movement. They'd be more foot soldiers, if we wanted to give an analogy. They are the pawns, and that they spread the idea and such, but they will never actually put the argument in a way that is palatable to others while also seeming rational and sane.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, there could be a kind of gradualism, as I might call it. So Jared Taylor is kind of infamous or famous in alt-right circles for, apart from my whiteness and all that, but the idea that he's not as overtly hostile towards Jewry. I actually think it's a strategy on his part to, you know, because it's bad. It's
Oh,
bad
it is.
PR.
Yeah, definitely.
But
I mean,
let's say the alt-right were to gain whatever, however you want to turn it, white nationalism in the United States ascendancy, that you could. It's basically what happened in Germany. You know, first there were financial limitations. It just got progressively worse, and where you get they're okay for now, but once you gain power, then you reduce their influence, etc. Eventually, you deport them or you eliminate them completely. That sort of thing.
The issue of doing that with ideology is essentially what you could do is that the Jews could say, or let's not even say Jews, let's say any movement that wants to slowly intensify or make its ideas more fanatical over time. Any more liberal members of that movement, or any less extreme members, when they see this extremist edge coming in, may not think it is a natural conclusion of the idea, and instead may see it as a usurpacious element that is slithering its way into their movement to try and turn it into a weapon. So while I do agree that is, it's one of the better strategies. It's better than Richard Spencer's. You know, we do want to examine your genes, but we won't actually use that to do anything. Idea.
Well, okay, then moving past the so-called JQ or the tribes people, I mean, Islam is a much more overt threat. I mean, it has a manifestation that mosques are being built in various places.
Sure.
You don't think that so-called identitarian movements in Europe could unite under something like that, even if they're disparate and different and come from different countries?
It's a lot easier to do because, as you said, it's a physical element. It's something you can definitely point to, and that's always important if you want a canary in the cave scenario. You know, you need something to point to say this is the way things are going. You can do that easily with Islam, but the problem is that Europe was affected by the Holocaust differently in the way that people responded to it and how that impregnated itself in their public consciousnesses. I mean, if you look at Germany, for instance, they would never. Germany is very hard. It's very pro the Holocaust. It's pro the Holocaust happened. It's not pro the Holocaust was good, to clarify. It's very pro the Holocaust happened. It's very strict on the kinds of things you can say in public and the kinds of things you cannot. That's more lax in other countries. So yes, Europe can try to fight Islam by uniting against it, but what you're going to see is a gradient of ability to do that and also a gradient of will to do that, because some countries might be more able to than others, but they might lack that cultural spark that you need to get that reaction. And that's one of the reasons why, more than anything else, what the alt-right really needs is a leader to step forward and accept the full weight of the ideas they are trying to get across. You have to accept the fact that violence is necessary. You have to accept the fact, well, not that violence is necessary, that violence may be necessary. You have to accept the fact that there may be bloodshed. You have to accept the bad things can happen, because when you do that, you are able to put forward a possible solution.
Yeah, but that's the problem. I mean, you're not real. I'm definitely not outright. I think I understand your position is really, you're not really outright. But
No.
But the thing with you can't, these days, as you know, in the public sphere, even proposing the possibility that somewhere down the line there might be some violent outcome or some eruption of violence is not acceptable. People are not going to say, well, yeah, it definitely could happen, and just move ahead with the policy. It has to be, quote-unquote, kosher, no pun intended. It has to be palatable to people.
That's not really true. If you look at Black Lives Matter, which is a movement that has gone violent.
Yes, but those right.
Same
but that's a certain type of person. If a bunch of white identitarians say that, it's apples and oranges, really. That's the issue.
The main issue is presentation in each case. So
I think there's something to do with the originator group. So if Black Lives Matter is violent, whatever, they're black and they're in the right because they're black. But I mean, let's be honest. There is a bias, certainly in the United States. I mean, the other day you asked Wojak what he did, and I guess he moves boxes. I mean, I did a whole podcast with him, and the reason why he does that, he's obviously very intelligent, is because he couldn't get any help or aid because he was a white male. So the point is that the point of origin is important in terms of how you present yourself, because if you're black and you present Black Lives Matter and you're violent, people in general will be a lot more forgiving of that than even the slightest enunciation of potential violence down the line from a figure such as Millennial Woes or Richard Spencer or Jared Taylor. You see what I mean?
Well, no, I understand that, but the question is, why is that happening? And it's because the presentation of each has been so slanted that it's now impossible to draw. Like, okay, when people think Black Lives Matter, they think black slavery, they think police brutality. What do people think of when they think of white nationalism? They obviously think of the Holocaust immediately. But that's more the presentation of it, and also how this information has been trickled into society. Like, Antifa is communist, okay? And the thing is that, well, it's not communist. It has Marxist leanings. I wouldn't say they're all communists, but because of its Marxist leanings, it did not present itself as a Marxist organization. Because Marxism does not have a totally great rep for obvious reasons. Instead, they presented themselves as anti-fascist. So it's pretty much the same thing in the way it's going to work and the way it's spread. But one is so much more palatable than another. Like, even people who have been hurt by communists cannot say no to Antifa, because anti-fascist. It's a perfect label. So really the question here would be more labeling. You would need a label which would allow you to attack Islam as an idea and not as a race. So yeah. I think that's more a question of framing.
Yeah, but that's what a guy like Sam Harris does. He'll always say, well, he's opposed to Islam, but it's not a race, it's a religion or whatever.
Well, yeah, but the problem with Sam Harris is Sam Harris doesn't have a label for it, and also he doesn't really have solutions. Like, he points out there's problems.
Well, that's because my theory is he's a milquetoast 90s style liberal, but yeah.
Well, I mean, the whole point is pointing out problems never really inspires anyone. This is why people like Richard Spencer haven't really taken off as well. He points out issues and he says, I want to do things like this, but that's an ideal world. And he admits he talks in an ideal world. Yeah, but that doesn't inspire people.
Well, I don't disagree, but Spencer in particular, he's just, in my view, an opportunist. As long as he maintains notoriety and relative fame, whether he gets this stuff done doesn't matter. He's more concerned about his haircut, his suit, and whether people are following him. I
think it's a mix of both, because there's easier ways to do that.
True.
He picked a particularly hard way, which would give him a very limited audience. So yeah, I think he would never really expect these things to come true, but I think he believes in them to some degree.
Yeah, well, I think in the internet age is in many ways an age of the passive. It's sort of this circulation of memes and information and things that that just have no place in public discourse still. I mean, what was the image we were just passing around about the various types of end folk, right? It's a total joke, and at the cafe that's totally acceptable and everyone can laugh about it. Especially as everyone's de facto included in that classification, but there are boundaries, and that's the thing. How do you move?
I've told you this before, but I think we already have our solution, and it is science.
Yes. Well, I don't disagree with that.
And I think what I mean by that is that, okay, let's say Islam is an issue. It's an issue if it can somehow get its hooks into Western society and change it from the way it is now to something more preferable to someone who believes in Sharia law. But it has a problem in that at the same time it's racing against science. because there's going to be a few innovations coming that will absolutely shatter our societies in every single way we can imagine. One is immortality, another is viable long-term VR, another would be non-conscious AI or conscious AI that are personal, a personal AI. Any one of these three things will just completely and utterly crack the way we organize society today.
I'll tip my hat off more at the latter two than the former. I'd like to get you on in the future to talk about things like immortality. It's kind of a separate discussion, but certainly VR. Already on Steam, there's this crazy game called VR Chat, and people are obsessed with it. So I think we're seeing foreshadowings, at least, of that sort of thing.
Well, the thing is with immortality, though, is that the life cycle people have now, everything we do now is because we have a very simple life cycle that can be split into 4 phases. 0 to 15, 15 to 35, 35 to 55, 55 to 70. And then you're dead. And see, the thing is, modern society is designed to occupy your time until you're dead. But once you actually lose the ability to die, well, things like the American dream cease to have meaning. What's the point of really raising a family?
I'd like to explore this. I'll briefly say that the following, that because this is somewhat off topic, but mortality definitely renders greater value unto the finite accomplishments. I mean, it's like the old thing with if you look at, you're familiar with traditional fantasy. Most fantasy settings, the elves live 1,000+ years, and they're sitting around watching the stupid humans scurry about. But another uniform observation in these fantasy settings is that, incredibly, the humans are more industrious and productive than the elves, because the elves have this sort of long. So maybe there's some truth to that. I'd like to do a separate discussion on both longevity, genes, and the theoretical implications. But let's accept that VR becomes so good so as to not be indistinguishable from reality. You still have your basic functions, you need to eat and shit, but it's so good that you'd actually rather spend 8 hours of free time a day in some VR setting than in any place else in reality. I think I agree that Islam and various other things it'd be difficult to compete with that.
Well, see, what's the point of religion when you can already have an eternal, peaceful, happy life on earth in a heaven you yourself get to define? And the fact is that not only that, you will see as it becomes easier for people to integrate with technology and the internet, the ways we communicate with the internet and the ways we communicate through the internet will probably take over. Sorry, fucking car or something.
And here I thought it was Jamal. You don't have Jamal. Never mind.
No,
bad
we
joke,
don't have
bad joke.
No. So the thing is that the internet is such a better way of communicating than everything else we have now. And the ways we communicate on the internet will probably take over the ways we communicate in real life as we become more and more integrated with it. Like, the brain is plastic. So it's quite easy to implant things into it. Sensors, wireless connectors and such. I was talking to a mutual friend of ours recently about how they've recently found ways to telepathically communicate signals from one person to another, or from one mouth to another.
I'm skeptical, but yes, okay.
So once you can do that in something kind of like an internet itself, or you can even wirelessly get information from the internet, I feel these ways of communicating will just utterly blow apart what we have now. So a lot of that layer of protection, like that layer of discourse and what's acceptable and what isn't, that bars internet thought from public consciousness, is going to cease to exist. I mean, once Generation Z gets big, like once Generation Z is 20-year-olds, you're going to see that disappear even more. And more, and more, and more, and more, and more.
Generation Z is what? Born in the 21st century, right?
Yeah, like 10-year-olds now. So in 10 years, you're going to see that barrier just collapse. And
it's definitely in the works, I think. And yeah, and I think because it's been going on for a while, I think as we move towards the end, I'd say that what will be fatal is a misinterpretation of how you say science or technology science, a new kind of industrialization interacts with us, because people tend to, and it's understandable why, prioritize ideologies as prime movers and causal factors rather than additive factors to an environment that gives birth to them, that allows for their existence. And these days, it's very much the environment itself that's fundamentally altering our very nature, be it physiological nature in terms of obesity and things like that, the problem, things that birth control did. And so as we move forward, I think it's critical from a scientific perspective, a sociological perspective, and a reality-based perspective to understand that these days, especially, the prime mover is this very interactive environment we have, and that will ultimately, as you're pointing out, trump ideological stuff.
Yeah, I see the way that things are going is internet and science will be the main definitions of what our societies are.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can take anything away from 2016, it's that a couple of people spamming a frog online beat an entire industrial media machine.
Yeah.
That's only going to become more. That's only becoming more obvious even this year.
Yeah.
And 2017, and then this year even more so again, and it will become progressively more so. Because the fact is, the more people, it's kind of like finance and currency in general, that the more people that buy into it, the more value it has.
Yeah.
And the more people that are able to integrate with the internet and are able to use technology and science, the greater an impact they have on society. So it's one feeds off the other, and you're going to get a progressive spiral, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But I think we cannot contest the fact that Corsica is a national treasure in regards to, of Ireland, in regards to the information he's provided us. For those of you who weren't familiar with the events of Ireland, I think you learned something. And then I do plan, as I've mentioned, having him on in the future. He's actually an aspiring scientist working in the field of genetics. He's very knowledgeable about this, among other things. And in addition to that, he probably could tear your head off, although I'm not sure how interesting that is for the purposes of discourse. But I definitely want to talk more about longevity, immortality, aging genetics with him in the future. And I think that it was a very informative conversation, and I want to thank him for his time. And I do regard him as a national treasure of Ireland. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to be on. I'm sorry my timeline earlier was not 100% correct.
The amount of detail you provided, all can be forgiven. I think most people would fail utterly at providing the level of detail of their national history that you did. So I think, once again, you're a credit to your people.
Okay.
That sounds...
I was going to say issues with the timeline were caused because I didn't want to get into too much detail.
Right.
It seems I may have.
I mean, comparatively speaking, if you were to ask your average German to give a history of Germany, they would stumble. United States, same thing. I mean, most people. And so I think you did an excellent job. I'd be shocked if people would complain about that. And a nice tail-end discussion as well. So everyone, thank you for joining us. And with a bit of luck and some leprechauns, I guess that's appropriate to say, we will get Corsica in the future to talk about perhaps the meatiest of all subjects, genes, immortality, future of the human race. Until then, I bid you adieu, and I wish you a pleasant weekend. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.